Yes.
So just to get a sense of the broad outlay of the original Tankies, who are now, they're spawning a new generation of scribblers who are echoing their line. But we mentioned Max Blumenthal and Greyzone and Aaron Mate and isn't Glenn Greenwald seems to be one of the major players in this panoply of miscreants. Don't you agree?
Well, it was Glenn Greenwald who favorably tweeted that quote from the most recent Chomsky interview, where Chomsky in turn had actually favorably cited Donald Trump for advocating appeasement of Putin, basically.
The legendary Bill Weinberg. For Glenn Greenwald, who was, at one point championed by Julian Assange's fans on the left, and he is consistently coming down on the right-wing side of issue after issue after issue. And he left The Intercept not on good terms. And now he's a regular on Tucker Carlson.
Yes, isn't it ironic?
How do we get to that point? Do you need to do research on that? I think you probably know a little bit about Glenn Greenwald.
Well, again, it's a part of the whole general tendency that we've been discussing here. I mean, there's this, convergence. Inevitably, is what we didn't really touch on, is that inevitably this leftist embrace of the foreign policy agenda of Vladimir Putin must inexorably mean a convergence of the the so-called anti-imperialist or radical left with the Trumpian right. Inevitably, inevitably, it means that.
Even as the Trumpians move to the notorious Viktor Orban, and CPAC has its conference, this supposedly American conservative organization of the affiliated with the GOP, they're having their annual convention in Hungary under the auspices of the full-on.
Yes, quite notoriously so.
That's a scary development, just came about in recent days, and I don't know if we've had a chance to fully digest the ramifications.
Yes, yeah, well, that's getting plenty of coverage, fortunately.
Well, everyone's outraged and shocked and quite frankly frightened by this development, because we know that the mastermind behind all of this is really Vladimir Putin and Alexander Dugin and their Eurasian followers, and they're quite shrewd at playing upon differences of opinion in America and Britain. I mean, they were largely behind Brexit with their propaganda machine. So are we leaving any of the important voices in the evil assortment of tanky voices, or have we covered the main ones?
Yeah. Well, we could go on all night, and just to, in turn, lest I be accused of alarmism in talking about, a convergence of the so-called radical left and the Trumpian right, which, could not be any more obvious when you've actually got, Glenn Greenwald favorably tweeting a quote from Noam Chomsky, who in turn is literally praising Donald Trump for, advocating appeasement of Putin in Ukraine. Nonetheless, I'm just going to point out to one incident. You mentioned Eurasianism, which is, of course, the ideology of Alexander Dugin, who is kind of like, the great granddaddy of, the Russo-nationalist right. And he has been, quite particularly plugging a convergence of the fascist right and the, the so-called anti-imperialist left against the West. And back in December 2014, the Duginists actually hosted an international conference on Moscow on the right of peoples to self-determination and building a multipolar world, end quote, bringing together various, Euro-fascist formations, which were supported by Putin. And among the participants was a delegation of American leftists, quote unquote, from the United Anti-War Coalition, UNAC, and the International Action Center.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and both of these entities, as we mentioned in our last segment, are spawn of the Workers' World Party, which is, the most intransigently pro-Moscow faction of the sectarian left. And interestingly, also in attendance at that Moscow confab, hosted by, the Duginists, was a delegation of white nationalists from a neo-confederate group called the League of the South. So these, supposed radical leftists and communists actually sat down and schmoozed with neo-confederate white nationalists in Moscow in December of 2014.
Kind of reminds me of that Jill Stein sitting down with
Bingo. Jill Stein, when would that have been? Let me Google that to get the exact date.
2015, I would guess, somewhere in there.
I think it was December of
earlier.
Hang on, I'll tell you.
And yet in 2016, there were people who thought of themselves as progressives who were enthusiastically supporting Jill Stein and who refused to vote for Hillary Clinton. Thinking that Trump would be no worse.
Hang on a minute.
I think it's sheer luck that Trump didn't get us into a war. Probably
Trump got us into a war. What are you talking about? It drives me crazy when people actually say that. Trump bombed the Syrian city of Raqqa into rubble. Of course, he got
we were
us
already engaged. That was Obama and
Obama started it. Obama started the bombardment of Raqqa. It's true. Trump massively escalated it. He massively escalated, airstrikes in Somalia. This whole notion that Trump was a peacenik is abhorrent.
All right, let's do another separate.
Hang on a minute.
I'll do a little research and pick your brain, because that's a very important point.
Oh God!
And you won't get that from Chomsky. And you won't get that from Greenwald. In fact, quite the opposite. Greenwald will tell you a lot of good things about Trump. And apparently Chomsky's going down that rabbit hole now too.
Oh God, how annoying.
Well, we're actually
hang on a minute. One moment. I'm trying to nail this down.
Well, you know that Jill Stein was schmoozing with the Russians. We knew that before Trump even got elected. But there's a lot of people out there who still call it the Russia hoax.
Yeah, okay. So in December 2015, Jill Stein, who was, the presidential candidate of the U.S. Green Party, actually attended a confab in Moscow hosted by RT, the organ of Kremlin state propaganda. When she actually, and this, mind you, this was as Putin was bombing Aleppo, as Putin's warplanes were bombing Aleppo into rubble, and she did not raise one peep of protest about it. She didn't say a word about it when she was in Moscow, and instead, spouted all of these empty pacifist homilies and saying that, she and Putin actually agreed about many things, quote unquote. And at the dinner at this affair, she was actually sitting at the table with Putin and with General Mike Flynn, who would later become Trump's national security advisor, and was the most aggressive voice in the final days of the Trump administration, calling for Trump to actually declare martial law and state of dictatorship in the country, basically, and cancel the election.
She kind of reminds me of when Shirley MacLaine met Deng Xiaoping, and she sucked up to him with an anecdote about a professor who had been sent to a re-education labor camp out in the country, and she met this professor, and he extolled how he learned so much from the peasants and the farmers. And she relayed the story to Deng, and Deng responded by telling her that professor was lying. So she bought into this glorious Maoist or post-Maoist propaganda line, and even Deng himself, realized that she was just a patsy, and he actually exposed her and really humiliated her on the spot.
Well, I mean, China is sort of a whole other conversation, but I would imagine that if this had happened during the Cultural Revolution, and then she actually had a discussion with it about Deng, it must have happened several years beforehand, because Maoism came to a screeching halt when Deng came to power.
I think the difference is if it was with Putin would have said yes, the professor was very happy. So there's kind of a twist there, but that's the topic for another day. Our time has run out. Bill is as always a vast storehouse of arcane knowledge on very important topics.
Entirely too arcane. It should be a lot more widely known.
That's my job. That's why we're here, and that's why we're gonna put this up on YouTube and hopefully figure out how to get some eyeballs and get some people, get this palatable and properly packaged and marketed so people can wrap their brain around it, because you're getting hit hard by some very slick propaganda, and we aim to counter that with the counter vortex to help people who are getting sucked in by all this propaganda resist the tide. Thank you, Bill.
Exactly. That's the whole point of the counter vortex.
Okay, to be continued.
To be continued.
Good night.
Good night.